into the sea, mountains into the sea.
Welcome to the Our State Book Club podcast. I'm your host, Wiley Cash. In this episode, we talk with novelist and short story writer Jill McCorkle about growing up in Lumberton and what it was like to launch her career with 2 books that came out on the same day.
Mountains in the sea.
Jill, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Wiley. It's great to be here.
So I want to begin by asking you about growing up in Lumberton. You know, we've talked with, so far this season, we've talked with Charles Frazier, who grew up in Andrews. We've talked with Lee, he grew up in Grundy, Virginia. I grew up in Gastonia, North Carolina. You grew up in Lumberton. And very often, I think young writers think that the story is waiting for them somewhere like New York City or Los Angeles. But what was it like growing up in Lumberton as a young writer or a young person who wanted to become a writer?
You know, I think it was with a lot of hindsight once I was writing that I was able to go back and think about it all and use the material. I was in the first class Lee ever taught at UNC, and she told me that as a 19-year-old from a small southern town, I had as much to say as the 50-year-old who had traveled many places in the world. And it just gave me permission to turn around and go back into that familiar landscape. Because I was doing, as you say, I was trying really hard to reach for something that was really out of my grasp in terms of understanding who the people were. Mm-hmm. And I think growing up in a small southern town, and you would know this too, I mean, a writer could not be handed a better gift. I mean, you grow up in this microcosm. I mean, you're not thinking about that as a 7 and 8-year-old
Sure.
or in high school. But as a writer, that comes back to me and is sort of my touch point over and over. And the way the older I get, the more I understand about what the conditions were in the town. A lot of things you don't even recognize at the time, class differences and racial divides that unfortunately were there.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything particular, your work, you know, we're going to talk about old crimes specifically in the next episode, but your work is so evocative, Jill, especially the last couple of books, is so evocative of memory and particular kind of set pieces that involve memory. Is there something in Lumberton that you just constantly feel your mind going back to that's just kind of your trampoline into the work, or just kind of your portal into memory? Is there an image or a song or a feeling or a season?
There are a lot of different things. I mean, I often have told my students that I think if you ever forget what it felt like to be a kid, then you have forgotten everything important that you need to know, because all those hard lessons come early. Maybe in what now seem like slight circumstances, but emotionally, you've gathered all the information. It's like, you know, Flannery O'Connor's thing, I'll misquote, I'm sure, but about how you emotionally you have all you need by adolescence, you know. And I think that we all get a great big footlocker crammed full of stuff. Yeah. I'll use that word here on our podcast. And then you spend the rest of your life unpacking it, you know? And I don't think we can live long enough to write about it all.
Yeah. I love that. I love that image of unpacking the footlocker of all of the things in our childhoods that were meaningful or painful or confusing. And, you know, a little bit later we'll talk about objects and how objects work in your writing. But I can imagine the objects that are filling so many of our footlockers if we were only to open them and see them.
Oh, yeah. And, you know, I often have had my students do an exercise where I give the word home. And I think I've told you this before. After almost 40 years, the images that I have received most often have been childhood beds and kitchen tables. And I go back in my own life, to those places of comfort. My grandmother's house is no longer there. The house I grew up in looks nothing like when I grew up. But those places are still very much alive. And yeah, it's like the well I keep going back to, for
they're
sure.
alive, and they're waiting for us to return to them to draw something
Absolutely
from them. So one of the first things I ever knew about you was that you had published 2 books on the same day when you were very young in 1984. Can you tell us about that experience and what led to it?
Yeah, terrifying. And luckily, I was as green as the grass out there and knew nothing about the business. I was kind of Louis Rubin's guinea pig in a lot of ways. I had been his student, and he graciously and generously had continued reading my work after I graduated. And I had no idea that he had this idea he wanted to start a publishing house, and that was Algonquin Books. Mm-hmm. And he took my first novel, and then out of sheer anxiety and not knowing what to do, I wrote a second novel. And he thought, I remember him saying, technically he found it to be the superior novel, and he said, but I'm not going to back out on the first one. How about, and I think it was Shannon Ravenel's idea to do the 2 at once. And I think the good news is that people were so interested in what he was doing that I got reviewed more than either as a single book would have gotten, because suddenly people could compare the 2, and that became a story. And I had been his student, and that was kind of a story. And, Algonquin was very much thought of as the little engine that could. And so I was lucky in that respect. But, if it had gone the other way, I would have been looking for another career.
Well, luckily, Louis Rubin knew what he was doing, right? I think a lot of people thought very highly of him and had no doubt that would be the case. But I first met you in Greensboro in 1998. I think I've told you this before. I heard you read from a short story titled "Your Husband is Cheating on Us," still one of the great titles. And I was so taken not only with your voice, your accent and just your voice, but also the voice of the first-person narrator and the story. A woman who is contacting the wife of the man she's having an affair with. And it is a hilarious premise. But by the end, the story becomes very painful and very heartrending. And it just blew me away. I was blown away by how you were able to swing the audience who was listening, enraptured, to this story. And then the reader, when they eventually read it, through these 2 emotions. But what I was really struck by was that you were someone who was unabashedly guided by place and guided by voice. And that meant something to me as a young person, having not been given the permission to write that way just yet in the college classroom. So can you talk about experiences that you might have had when you were young that were similar to the experience that I had hearing you read for the first time?
Absolutely. Max Steele was my first writing teacher at UNC, and he brought in a recording. An enormous machine with reel-to-reel tape. And out of it came the voice of Eudora Welty, reading Why I Live at the P.O. And listening to her voice and listening, and my dad worked at the Lumberton post office, and I knew all the people there, and I was just thinking, whoa, it was so close to home. And then at the end of that class, Max said, and there's this young writer we're really hoping to hire, and if we do, I'm going to put you in her class. And that was Lee. Mm-hmm. And so suddenly I had these teachers who were so real. I mean, and they still knew the work. They had read the books, but they also, were at the grocery store and raking their yards. And so it was the first time for me to have that wonderful, when worlds collide, it's not always a good thing, but when you're learning that, yes, maybe you could do this, it was just an eye-opener for me.
And Daniel Wallace has told me that recently about the magic of Chapel Hill, having professors like Lee, and how possible it seemed to him to be able to do the thing that she was doing. I mean, this was a woman who talked like people he knew, that he would see in town. He said Doris Betts would be crossing the street, and it wasn't like some distant god who was doing something untouchable.
Right.
And
they were all teaching. Yeah, I mean, I think so many writers in this state have spent much of their careers teaching.
We're going to take a quick break, but we'll be right back with Jill McCorkle. This podcast is produced by Our State Magazine, celebrating North Carolina travel, food, history, and culture since 1933. Check out ourstate.com, where you can explore exclusive content like digital stories, YouTube videos, newsletters, and more. To have each month's issue delivered to your mailbox, visit ourstate.com/subscribe and enter promo code BOOKCLUB, one word, Book Club. That's BOOKCLUB for $5 off any regular or gift subscription. We are back with Jill McCorkle. So, Jill, you've written so many different types of fiction, but you are best known for short stories and your novels. How do you know when you're writing a short story, and how do you know when you're writing a novel? Or does the work tell you?
The work dictates that. Occasionally, more often, I've had stories that don't come full term, and I end up plugging those people into a novel where they function as minor characters sometimes, and then it's just an added dimension. Rarely does it work in the other direction. That the idea for a novel is a story.
Yeah.
And I think early in my career, I've always admired the short story form, but I think I really gave it short shrift. I think I thought that whatever pieces didn't fit in the novel, I could somehow scrap into a story. And that was a very cheap way of thinking. Yeah. And so over the years, I've really just come to appreciate the form more and more. And I probably spend, I could probably write 2 novels for a collection of stories.
Yeah.
It's, I don't know. I revise a lot more when I'm working on stories.
And stories are these very finely wrought jewels that have to be manicured and trimmed and bolstered, whereas novels can be these sprawling, messy things that can still have messes in them when they're published.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you can get away with a little bit of flab here and there. Easier with a novel.
And a little bit of not knowing as well.
Oh, yeah. And the thing about a novel is, on the way to the end of the novel, you're learning and growing with the novel. Whereas a story, I feel like it's when I get to the end that the work begins.
So in the last segment, we talked a little bit about your experience studying under and working with people like Louis Rubin and Max Steele and Lee Smith. And you've worked with a lot of wonderful writers who have gone on to publish. Can you talk about some experiences you've had in the classroom, or things that you particularly want to make sure your students understand or are exposed to, or whatever kind of impressions you can leave them with about prose?
Yeah, I think it's not about prose in particular, just their writing life in general. I think the first thing I'd like to instill is the kind of total freedom that they give to whatever they're working on, and not to judge, censor, edit too soon. I think a lot of people get in trouble when they immediately are imagining everybody who's going to read it and what the criticism will be even before the work is done. And I think as soon as you start thinking that way, you close off all these avenues of what might just blow in out of left field. And for me, that's the excitement of the work. And so I like to work knowing that it could be I'm the only person who ever sees this, that I give myself the privacy and freedom, that you give yourself in your mind.
Yeah, that's an important lesson. Yeah, sometimes when people come to me and they say, I've got the best idea for a novel and I already know what the cover's going to look like, I always think you're never going to write that book.
Yeah.
If you're already focusing on the cover, you are never going to write that book.
Yeah, that's pretty scary.
Yeah.
And the other thing I would try to instill is, there's no right way. There's no one way. There's room for a lot of different kinds of books and stories told. I mean,
there's no easy way to do it.
And no easy way to do it except to sit down and start working.
That's right. So I have a lightning round that I like to do with our guests. And I want you
That sounds scary.
It's a little scary. No. It is, I just want you to answer what comes into your mind and not think too much about what I'm going to ask you. All right. So first question, coleslaw or potato salad?
Coleslaw.
Oh, interesting. Biscuits or cornbread?
Cornbread.
Favorite vacation spot in North Carolina?
In North Carolina, well, the coast.
Okay.
And the southeastern stretch there. I mean, I grew up a little over an hour from Myrtle. So I would say from, the state line up to Wrightsville would be my prime.
You spent a lot of time in Oak Island when you're writing, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, wonderful.
Holden.
Holden.
Yeah, and I grew up going to Oak a lot.
Well, this has been such a pleasure, Jill. Thank you so much for doing this with me.
Thank you. My pleasure.
This episode was recorded and produced by Hunter Brady. Our theme music is by Wilmington, North Carolina's Beta Radio. Wiley Cash's wardrobe provided by Gentleman's Corner with locations in Wilmington, Cary, and Pinehurst.
What might it be like underneath the sunrise in a state of flight? Coming back on me, it seems wonderful, the wandering mountain birds on a beach. Never moments ever wasted, turning away from your love. Honeybees, gardens of sweeter fruit, never tasted, no turning to other things. Will you be, will you seem, sweeter fruit, never tasted, don't turn your back on me. Mountains pushing into the sea.